bear with me a second. I'm just setting up the, it will always go when I go to do the screen share, it tries to share things that are not what I'm wanting shared. Bit of a lag. And that, as I said, would happen. That's my dog just moving because my daughter's just coming home. So that should be. I'm just going to check that that's showing fine. I'll get to the start of the presentation. And there we go. Sorry about that slightly slow start. So today we're going to be looking at. Last week we looked at how do you know if something's causing post-exertional malaise and or post-exertional symptom exacerbation. And today we're going to do a little bit of a review over some of the things we've covered before, and then we're going to look at what you do about it if that's happening, and generally how you do activities in or can do activities in a less fatiguing way if you have post-exertional malaise. So a lot of people know who I am, but for those who don't, I am co-chair of Stockport ME Group. We're a sort of a local ME CFS group in the northwest of England, and I've been co-chair for about 10 years or so, and in that time I've supported a lot of people and done a lot of projects around issues to do with ME. And really what we're looking at in these sessions is sort of the basics of pacing, which is fundamental to condition management with ME, but also for a lot of people with long COVID. So that's sort of what we're sort of looking at. And when I talk about post-exertional malaise, I would sort of stress it's quite a broad sort of category of symptoms that people can experience. So whilst fatigue is very common, in some people it manifests itself as pain, brain fog, nausea, a wide range of symptoms. And it's not always clear whether or not something is post-exertional malaise or whether it's got another cause. One key feature with post-exertional malaise is a sort of a delayed response longer than you get for many other issues and conditions. So that's kind of a sort of fundamental. In the very first session I did, which the recording's still available for, 8 weeks, look at a little bit more how you can kind of tell a little bit or get a bit of an idea whether or not you might have post-exertional malaise. Hopefully the people who are here have kind of got a good sense that it is an issue they experience. Last week we looked at sort of how you can sort of tell, and one of the biggest problems a lot of people have is that if you're doing a lot, you're doing lots of things that may be triggering post-exertional malaise, and it's really hard to know what is triggering what, because you might have done 5 activities within the last week or so, and you don't know which were the ones that were causing the problem and which were not. So one of the best ways of kind of working out what's causing your issues is to reduce your activities, so you can kind of get a bit more of a sense of what might be causing problems. We talked about activity diaries as being potentially very useful.
After the ear tube surgery, because I was like kind of trying to Google just to get a sense, and like it only really talked about with kids, so I just kind of wanted to know like if I could plan my day as normal or if I should plan to rest.
We're going to be getting to that sort of soon. I think with what I would say with sort of pacing is it's very different for each person. You kind of need to sort of know if it's an issue experience. Often we need to do a lot less than we did. But I'm going to be looking at this with some specific examples as the session sort of goes. I would sort of say quite one problem with activity diaries, which a lot of people find, is they'll get recommended to do them, but actually doing activity diaries is a lot of work. So if you're not actually going to use the activity diaries at all, then just have a think about whether that is a good investment of your energy. It potentially can be, but it's very easy just to do them because you've been told to do them. And currently I don't do activity diaries. I have done in the past, but you want to make sure if you're doing them, there's a good reason. If you look back at what you've done over the last 12 hours to 48 hours, that's like if you're feeling awful and you experience post-exertion malaise, that will quite often be able to help work out what it is that has caused an issue. If it's not just generally doing too much, as is sometimes the case. And over time, you'll get a bit of a sense of what you can and can't do. If something triggered an issue yesterday or a week ago, or 2 weeks ago, it's more likely to trigger an issue moving forward. Heart rate monitoring, heart rate visibility, heart rate variability, sorry. That's what happens when the dog tries to settle back down. They can be very useful tools as well, as they can provide useful information, and it's also slightly objective. So it's not just based on your own perceptions of things. And if you've got sort of allies, people who understand you, who know a bit about post-exertional malaise, potentially they can kind of be useful in helping you work out whether something's causing an issue or not. And also, I'd really recommend, if you're able to, getting one-to-one help, because I certainly couldn't have learned how to pace effectively on my own. I only got where I am today by getting a lot of help from a lot of people, some of whom were professionals. And now I covered this sort of slide last week, but I covered it quite quickly, and I want to spend a little bit more sort of time on it. I'm going to go through this in a lot more detail with some examples. But as I was sort of saying, if you're experiencing post-exertional malaise, it's not always a specific thing that causes post-exertional malaise. Sometimes it's the accumulation of things. So if you look at like an energy envelope, you might have so much that you can do in a day, and you might be doing that and doing more. And it's often not so much a particular task or a particular activity you're doing, but how much you're doing in a day. So often the solution, which isn't the solution maybe you want to hear, is just to do less. And sometimes that can involve sacrifices, it can involve working less hours, it can involve giving up on some responsibilities, reallocating responsibilities, putting up with certain things not being done and not being done as well. But it's a key sort of lesson that many of us need to learn. Sometimes if you're doing things and they're causing issues, if you can stop doing them sooner, that can make a big difference. But getting help from other people, it doesn't necessarily need to be you who does everything. And aids and adaptations can make a big difference. And if you have an activity that is tiring and does need to be done, if you're able to rest beforehand and afterwards, and sometimes you can actually rest during activity and break it up a bit, that can all make a massive difference. And what I would say for specific tasks and issues, you have a whole community to draw on. So many of people who are here from Long COVID Support, it's got 60,000 odd members, many of whom need to pace, many of whom have a wide variety of experience of pacing and of different life experiences and situations and challenges. And they can often help you to sort of get a good sort of idea of what might be a good solution in your circumstance, what works for them. So there'll be many situations which I don't experience, and other people might have the right sort of answers. And it's not necessarily finding the right answer for you. Sometimes consider what's right for you. There's resistance there, there's barriers there for you really taking on board what's the right thing to do, and hearing what other people do doesn't necessarily mean you do the same thing, but can maybe help you look at that situation from a different perspective and where you can find the answer that's right for you. I do sort of want to highlight quite often there's other elements you can change in a task, environmental factors. It might be, so if you look at the moment, I'm delivering this session lying down. If I sit up, my dysautonomia makes my symptoms a lot worse, and the experience becomes a lot more exhausting for me. So a small adjustment I've made is delivering this session lying down. And quite often there's other sort of things you can do to change how you go about a task that don't necessarily change the task, but can make a big difference. There's also a couple of advanced pacing concepts, preemptive rest and switching. They're not complicated, they're just maybe things you do a few weeks into pacing rather than straight away, but I'll cover them with some of the examples that I'm going on to. So I know that's quick, but it's looking at things in like broad strokes. I'm going to look at some, and shortly I'll look at some individual examples, which kind of give it a bit more sort of sense of how things work in reality rather than in the abstract. Before I do though, there's a couple of more things I sort of want to sort of cover. So it's to look at what can make what we're doing more tiring, and then if you remove it, sort of what can make it less tiring. So if you look at the cumulative amount of what we do, so if you take today, I'm delivering this session, I've made sure I didn't do that much during the day beforehand, so I got plenty of rest, because if I'd tried to do this after doing a full day, it might have been a little bit too much for me. So if you've had a lot of rest, you might be able to do an activity and it not take so much out of you. But equally, if you've been stretching yourself quite thin and doing a little bit too much, then you trying to do an activity might be much more draining than you expect. Broadly speaking, you could look at how long you do something and how intense it is. I do want to stress that when we're looking at activities, I'm meaning that in the broadest sense. So thinking about something, feeling something, eating food and your body digesting it, all these in some ways can be seen as being activities in the sense we're looking at, they all can use up energy. It's not just, a to-do list that you've got in front of you with actual, tasks to complete. It's much broader than that. Now, we all have different things that can make activities more tiring or less tiring. So for me, if I'm standing, that's more tiring. I'm sound sensitive, so if there's lots of noise sources, that makes it a lot more tiring. Each one of us will be slightly different in what those environmental factors are. Each of us might have different health issues. So in my case, I've got respiratory issues, I've got dysautonomia. So if it's colder, that might trigger some respiratory issues. It might make something more fatiguing if I'm not maybe wrapped up warm enough, if I'm not managing the respiratory issues well. So all of those things potentially could affect how much energy I use or how tiring something is. We all have individual stressors as well. Some people are very stress sensitive. Some people, if they haven't had enough sleep, that can make everything a lot more exhausting. And you kind of need to find out what the sort of right ones are for you. One thing I've found, very few people who experience post-exertional malaise can multitask or do sort of particular activities with a mental and a physical component without it being exceedingly more tiring than just if they were doing a physical activity or a mental activity. Before going into some specific examples, I do want to touch on some risk issues. The first one is when you're identifying something that's you think is causing you post-exertional malaise, it might be causing something else. It's not a bad idea to try to keep the medical profession in the loop. In my case, I think I've said a few times before, for 10 years I've had dysautonomia and it wasn't being treated, it wasn't being acknowledged. And a lot of what I thought was post-exertional malaise was actually dysautonomia. I had post-exertional malaise as well, but some triggers weren't that at all. There was something else. And there's other issues that people have as well. Some people have heart problems, some people have respiratory issues. There's a wide variety of issues that people can have, which is maybe a comorbidity or another sort of condition that needs looking at rather than just sort of post-exertional malaise. So you do need to be mindful of that, but also, in my time running the ME group, I've encountered lots of people who've experienced lots of issues where there were sort of safety elements that they maybe hadn't thought of because they were doing an activity they did when they're well and they're carrying on doing it. So I can think of just last summer, I started doing some cooking. I turned the pan on. I went and sat down to have a little rest. I forgot the pan was on, and I trashed the pan. And my fire alarm wasn't working properly, and it didn't warn me. And quite a lot of smoke built up until the dog actually told me that there was a problem. I'm not the only person that's happened to. There's lots of examples. Sometimes people find they're no longer safe driving, and sometimes it's just a case of almost like, if you were starting and if you were running a company and starting it for the first time, you had to do a risk assessment of everything that you do. It just might be worth kind of doing a version of that. We just approach what you're doing and think, am I safe doing this? Am I going to be able to do an activity in a way that actually is safe? And that can be very sort of broad. We're not just looking at obvious examples like fire risk and, am I safe to drive, but do I need someone to check this email before I send it? Do I need someone to, check something else before I do something? So it's just really, it's a sort of a food for thought sort of idea for just people to think about, because there's certainly a lot of issues that I've come across, not just for myself, but for other people, where there have been safety issues that they haven't thought of. When we're talking about doing tasks differently, an analogy I've sort of suggest is like, if you can imagine, like, how would you do something if you've broken your arm and your arm is in the plaster? How would you do it if someone had put a blindfold over your eyes? Because quite often when we do tasks, as someone who's got post-exertion malaise, a lot of what we're basing what we do on is on what we did when we were well. And sometimes what we're almost needing to do is to reinvent how we do things. Some people with they might get ill and then they need to sort of it happened to someone local to me where they got COVID. It was actually they were a teenager and they basically had to learn to walk again. And it was all sort of different, but I kind of think for all of us with long COVID and ME, we often have to look at the tasks that we do. Well, we might even do automatically and actually break down how we do them and think, do we need to do these differently? Because if you see the sort of example, mouse slips have gone on a page of like a mouse in a maze where the cheese is always in the same place. Someone's like moved the cheese somewhere else. We might need to find different ways of doing those same tasks that we've always done before. Now, there's a few questions in the comments. When I'm running a presentation, I basically see the presentation and the questions in the comments are quite hard to sort of go to. So I'm keeping half an eye on them. But in terms of answering them, I'll kind of get to that after the presentation. So do bear with me. And I will sort of say as well that a lot of people find that they have quite a lot of resistance to this change. And it can be quite hard to accept that you need to do things differently. That might not be for every task. It might be for some tasks. It might be, so for instance, some people make a lot of changes in their personal life, but in their work life, they try to do the job the way they did before they were ill. Maybe also they're worried that if people kind of see them doing things differently, they'll think they can't do them properly. There's lots of situations where sometimes people might be, I have an 8-year-old daughter. Some people, they might have children. They kind of want to be the way they were with the children before they were ill, but there may need to be sort of adjustments made so that they can actually be the person they need to be today with the health issues that they have. So I want to go into a few specific examples. One of the people here I was speaking to yesterday, I was joking that was actually going to be we're talking about cutting the grass, and I was actually going to had a slide that was just about cutting the grass. Cutting the grass, it's quite a good example of a physical task. It's a task many people with long COVID couldn't do because it'd be too physical. It is something I am able to do to a point. And I think it's a good example of what I do and what's worked for me, because it gives a bit of an idea when I'm talking about how to do something in a more sort of paced way. Now, for different people, it might be different things. So for instance, with cutting the grass, some people might have a sit-on mower that they sit in, so then they're not having to stand. Different people have different solutions that are work for them. So what I found, now I've got quite a small patch of grass, but what I sort of found was when I was cutting the grass, now I use a heart rate monitor, and that shows by the heart rate, gives a good indication of overexertion. And when I was cutting the grass, it was going up to initially it was going up to maybe about 115. Now anything over about 98-ish, in my case, is something that is fairly likely with a physical task to be causing post-exertional malaise. So a few things that I sort of found helped. One of them was if the grass got longer, it was more tiring. So what I found is that if I was able to cut the grass more often, then it was less of an issue of it getting like too long, too wet. and it made it more manageable. So actually doing it more often rather than less. I taught my daughter how to cut the grass, and she does most of it. I do the edges. That made a big difference. It took a couple of times initially to get her comfortable and safe doing it. Um, and also, I sort of found that if I if the grass got a bit long and I cut it, then it was really fatiguing. And if I cut the grass in a house setting, that made it sort of less tiring. And also, I would do it over quite a bit of time. So I would cut a little bit of grass, go and lie down, cut a little bit of grass, go and lie down, or sit down. And the whole sort of amount of grass I've got, it doesn't take very long, and it's probably a job that could be done in 20 minutes, but I would break it into about three goes with sort of rest in between. So that sort of worked for me. But for some people that wouldn't be possible. It maybe you just need other people to do it. You might want to be looking at replacing the grass with a different surface, like artificial grass. But I think this is quite a good example because it's a task that a lot of people will have some idea of, and the solutions that I have come up with won't necessarily be the solutions for yourself, but it's kind of going back through the sort of process of what I'd sort of looked for earlier in terms of changing sort of different sort of aspects of a task, and sort of drawing on some of these sort of tools. Now, in my case, I got to use heart rate monitoring to give a good indication of how exerting cutting grass was, and that kind of refined it a little bit. But that's sort of a good sort of overview, and that's for where I am, where I was over last year. Other times I might be able to do it more easily or less easily, but that's one thing I will say is that whatever you do potentially need to be like looking at adjusting it for different wellness levels. So I wouldn't attempt to cut the grass on some days, and today I'm a little bit more fatigued than normal. I wouldn't even attempt to cut the grass on a day like today. So I'll tap on a few sort of more examples. So say you have complicated paperwork. Now, one thing I've found is that the more I can do, so in my case with dysautonomia, I do things lying down, that's better. So try to move and position things so I can access them lying down. I sort of minimize noise, so I don't have lots of sound sources. I generally do my paperwork when my wife's out working, or I take it upstairs and do it in a room on my own, because any sort of distractions make it more tiring. Similarly, I don't do it when my daughter's at home. So I pick the times when I will do sort of paperwork. Another thing I found very helpful with paperwork and other sort of mental tasks in general is if something's particularly fatiguing, to actually have a think about why. So sometimes there's resistance, sometimes there's stress, sometimes there's another factor that's making something more tiring. In some cases, I found what I'll do with some things is I'll actually ask my wife to check over things, because it might be it's like looking to renew insurance or something like that. And some of what might be making it more tiring is that I know how important it is I get it right. So I'm focusing really, really hard to make sure that I'm not messing things up and I'm actually getting the insurance we need. So, having somebody else to check things over that I trust can make a big difference. And sometimes there's things like I found, I'll have lots of documents to file, and then I think, do I actually need to file this? When will I need this? And I've just basically gone through things and I've done lots of recycling, and that sort of made a big difference. That sometimes it's easy to think of, oh, I need to do something, but it's not always the case that things need to be done. And I've talked a little bit about preemptive rest. Now, the idea of preemptive rest is if you do a task, let's say you do it for an hour, and then you find you're getting up signs of fatigue. You're picking up, it might be a headache, it might be your brain doesn't sort of work well, you might be getting some brain fog. Next time you do that sort of task, try stopping a bit before, So if it's an hour, then maybe you stop after 55 minutes, maybe 50 minutes, and have a rest, and then see if that makes a difference. And I found that with a lot of mental work, if I do that, it basically makes the work sort of less fatiguing. The longer I do it, it becomes like exponentially more tiring. So by stopping sooner, I can restart sooner and I can do a lot more in a day. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people really like the sort of spoon theory, which is the idea you might have, say, 12 spoons worth of activity and energy to spend in a day. And I've sometimes found that not so helpful, because if I actually break tasks down, do things like preemptive rest, maybe switch from mental tasks to physical tasks, or tasks that I find stressful to tasks I don't find stressful, and then I can actually do more, so that the spoons don't really sort of tie in brilliantly for me. Now, meals out, they're an example. It's not something I could do at the moment, because you generally can't lie down and have a meal out. Also, I'm quite sound sensitive, and I've got quite a lot of food intolerances. So it's not something I would do myself, but it is something some people would consider. Things that have worked in the past before my dysautonomia got really bad. I would do sort of things like, sometimes if I'd go out with my wife and daughter for a meal, I might just have one course whilst they have two. I might kind of just go to places that are nearby, and go to places that are quiet. And what I found with going to places that are quiet is you can't go to the same place, because all the quiet places go out of business, because them never having anyone there, it works good for me, but it doesn't work well for their business model. But that was sort of helpful. Some people have found things, if they're sound sensitive, they found things like there's specially designed earplugs that are basically designed to reduce them. They don't stop you hearing, but they reduce the amount of sound sources. And doing things, wearing things like that enables some people to do more things that are out in public when they're sound sensitive. I've done things in the past, like, gone and had a rest in the car partway through a meal and come back out, so I missed maybe 15 minutes of a meal or something like that. Sometimes it's about starting off from a different perspective, not what would I normally do, but what is a way that I can do this regardless of social norms, that enables me to get what I want to get out of this, that also works for those I'm with. And sometimes it can involve doing things that feel a bit strange, and a lot of people might not need to do some of the things that I do, but just sort of look at and consider what could possibly work for you. I don't want to, I've got quite a lot of examples, but because I want to open up to questions, I'm only going to cover sort of a couple more. But I thought showering and washing is quite an important example, because a lot of people don't necessarily, they struggle with showers and baths. They find them very tiring. So I wanted to cover a few things I found sort of helpful for me. So one of the things I'll do is I generally don't wash if I'm alone in the house, if I'm at all feeling sort of weak, because I'm prone to falling. I've got mobility aids, so you can see the larger sort of picture there. That's my bathroom. So I've got a sort of a step with a handrail to help me get up. I've got a handrail. Some people find bath boards really helpful, or shower seats really helpful. I have a shower seat. I don't use it all that often, but I have a shower seat, so I can potentially have a shower sitting down. I tend to lie down and have a bath, because that's less fatiguing for me. One thing I have found makes a massive difference to how fatiguing washing is the temperature of the water. If it's too kind of different from my body temperature, then it seems to be more fatiguing. That's not always the case with people. Some people find cold showers less tiring. It is a bit of a case of experimenting. This is also something where I found heart rate monitoring helpful, because the heart rate monitor would give a reasonable indication of how fatiguing it was. And so I've done a little bit of adapting, experimenting with that. A lot of people don't necessarily consider aids and adaptations in terms of showers. I found it really helpful and makes a lot safer for me. And it is kind of doing what's right for you. But again, it's a little bit of that idea of saying before, don't necessarily look at how you used to do something. Maybe look at how, in terms of how you are now, what is safe and what takes less energy. So another example, and this is probably the final example I'll cover before opening up to questions, is so working a 9 to 5 office job. Now, I don't work a 9 to 5 office job. I haven't done any paid work in about 10 years because I've had ME and it's been quite bad, and paid work's not really been possible. Before I got ill, though, I used to work in for the disability charity Breakthrough UK, and my job was basically helping people who were disabled overcome the barriers they're facing in employment to work. So some of what I'm sort of taking is drawing from there, and some of it's general sort of pacing principles. One thing I'd sort of highlight is quite often there's even adaptations that can make things a lot easier. Most people who work from home won't necessarily have had an ergonomic assessment carried out on good sort of posture for them working. A lot of people are working from home a lot more after the pandemic. And sometimes just little things like having the right posture and the right support can actually make work less fatiguing. If you need to lie down, you can potentially be using aids. So you can see in the top right, there's an example of a sort of a laptop table for people like myself who need to be reclined lying down. There's a lot that you can do to negotiate different arrangements with employers. So in the UK, we talk about reasonable adjustments. I think in the US, it's more be accommodations. But broadly speaking, what we're talking about is getting our access needs met so that we can work to the best of our abilities. And I've found a lot of employers, if you approach things from a legal duty, sometimes they can be quite resistant. Sometimes it can open their mind to consider something, but really looking from the perspective of how they can get the most out of you as an employee is if you're able to do your job properly. And very, very few people do 100% of everything that they're ideally supposed to do in a job for lots of reasons. Some people might be shy, they might be too tall, too small to do a particular task. Some might be better dealing with complaints than others. There all tend to be different things that we do in a sort of jobs. The idea that because of a health condition, I don't do one task in the same way, it's often something that is quite easy for employers to change what they do and do things differently. And also, sort of say, going back to the start, you don't necessarily need to do the same job in the same way that you were doing before you were ill. There may be different things you can do, whether it's negotiating different arrangements with your employer or with a different employer or doing a different type of work. You do not have to do what you did before. There are also a lot of things you can, an obvious adjustment might be working from home more often. Sometimes that means it's less fatiguing, you've got less travel time. And another big sort of thing I would suggest is that if you're using more energy than you should in a job on a given day, try to think of what you can do to minimize the rest of what you do in that day. So some people shower the night before they're going to work, so they have less to do on the day. Sometimes it's easy to think, well, I'm going to go and do my shift and then I'm going to go and meet up with some friends. And it's like, well, maybe you've used the energy that you have for the day doing the work, so you have to avoid meeting up with friends and you have to go home and rest. But it's about working out what's right for you. We've all got different energy levels, and we've all got the extent to which if we overdo things is very different. So for me, if I overdo things, bare minimum, it's going to take me 2-3 days to recover, probably a week or two, and potentially, sometimes overdoing things in a day has taken 6 months for me to recover from it. It's not been an easy 6 months recovery process when that's been the case. So we're all quite different in terms of how much energy we've got, what uses that energy, and what the consequences are if we kind of do a little bit too much. So you do have to adapt it for you, but there is the danger when we sort of look at energy envelopes, if you're doing too much, that what will happen is your energy envelope will shrink. And then what that means is you've got less energy the next day, and then it shrinks. You've got less energy the next day, and then it shrinks. You've got less energy the next day. So you kind of get in this sort of like a debt cycle, if you think in terms of like credit cards and money, where you just keep spending too much, and eventually there's a danger it catches up with you. So you do need to sort of watch out on what you do and what is feasible for you. So I've done quite a few of these, but I want to sort of open up to sort of questions. I did want to briefly finish up on a few sort of 10 pacing tips that are sort of a little bit broader, and then I'll open things up for questions. So my biggest tip for people who need to pace is to do less, because if you're experiencing issues, doing less is often the most beneficial thing you can do. Megan, you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask something now?
Oh, I'm sorry, I can wait till you're done.
Okay, that's fine. I'll only be about 30 seconds or so. Again, the sort of second session I did was really looking at adding structured rests to your day and trying to improve the quality of those rests. Another tip would be to sort of get help. Now, I was lucky. Within a month of being diagnosed, I was getting one-to-one support from occupational therapists. Not everyone gets that, but it made a massive difference to me. And I do think very, very few people can completely master pacing as well as possible on their own. I found heart rate monitoring helpful. That's going to be next week's sort of topic. It's going to be looking at heart rate monitoring and try to keep within your aerobic threshold to minimize the chances of experiencing post-exertional malaise. If you can work out what's causing PEM and draining energy and eat and try to do those things less or differently, that can be really helpful. If you are experiencing symptoms of PEM, stopping if possible, and maybe reviewing in the future, could you have done that differently? Avoid delegating, asking for help, learning to do tasks that can be fatiguing in a more paced way. That's really what we've been looking at today. And the other sort of ones are just sort of adapt and adjust your day based on your energy level. You don't have the same energy every day. So sometimes I think people do this too far, where they might they might have lots of bad days and they have a good day and they try to get everything that they've missed over the past month done. Advice I was given was on a good day, try to do maybe 70% of what you can do in a bad day comfortably, or that would like fully sort of use you up. So basically you kind of work within your broader energy levels to try to flatten those out, and make use of peer support. You've got in long COVID support, you've got 60,000 resources out there that can help you, that have similar experiences or complementary experiences. There's a lot of issues where a lot of people know more than me, and they'll have more relevant experience, and where possible, recruit those around you to assist, or at least not act against your resting and pacing. There's no point resting and pacing if a minute into your rest, you get lots of people coming into the room, interrupting that rest and stopping it. So you kind of need to get those around you on your side. So that's it for the presentation. Again, I'm a little bit behind in following the chat, but if I could go to Megan first. I'm just going to stop recording.